Hello, I'm Emma Dixon.
Hello, I'm Selena Anderson.
I'm Desiree Kosser.
Welcome to our Tide Talk.
There are many out there that greatly influenced the civil rights movement.
The case of Brown versus the Board of Education.
The Little Rock Nine.
People like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr.
And the death of Emmett Till.
Segregation was a major issue in the 20th century, which brings us to our first topic, Brown versus the Board of Education. Court cases brought up arguments about the legal doctrine in the Constitution that lets segregation to occur as long as the segregated areas are equal. This law was basically to allow racism and discrimination in the U.S., so when Oliver Brown challenged his local all-white elementary schools board, many were shocked. Brown was one of the 18 different cases of injustice of the separate but equal laws in 1954. By the end of the case, the court decided the law was against the 14th Amendment. Any thoughts? Okay, so I think that they introduced a good amount of people when they did.
I think the separate but equal laws should never have existed.
Yes, I think that it was a way to allow discrimination and racism along it, and definitely the segregated parts were not fair. Either side, one may be better, one may be worse. They weren't the same, and they definitely needed a better way to make sure that they are equal, and they weren't. So when people would challenge that it wasn't equal, some people would just turn the cheek and say, yeah, they were, but they really weren't. And I feel like around that time, people really should have paid attention to just how equal they were.
I don't have any thoughts.
Okay.
The Little Rock Nine made a huge example of segregation in school. A group of African American high school students challenged racial segregation in the public schools of Little Rock, Arkansas. Melba Patillo, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, Minnie Jean Brown, Terrence Roberts, Charlotta Walls, Jefferson Thomas, Gloria Ray, and Thelma Mothershed. Little Rock Central High School was an all-white school. The 9 students were able to enroll because of the Brown versus the Board of Education, which declared segregation in school was unconstitutional. Many times, the Little Rock Nine were threatened to be beaten and killed. White protesters were becoming violent, attacking African American bystanders, as well as reporters for northern newspapers. The students were sent home, but they returned on September 25th, protected by U.S. soldiers. But the violence continued, and in one instance, the student was expelled for fighting back. The remaining 8 students, however, attended the school for the rest of the academic year. Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. Governor Faubus was re-elected in 1958, and rather than permit desegregation, he closed all of Little Rock's schools. Many districts in the South followed Little Rock's example.
I personally am very glad that the Brown versus Board of Education case really did bring up different issues, especially with the Little Rock Nine. So, yeah, Little Rock schools were not equal, so they said, hey, let's bring in some students. And I'm very glad that it was like a chain reaction from the Brown versus the Board of Education.
I'm glad that they brought in the more students, but I think they could have done it in a better way that would have resulted in maybe less violence. Because if you introduce so many all at once, it's kind of a shock to all the other students. They have to get used to that, this massive amount of new students. Where if you introduce them slower, like maybe a few at a time, there would have been less violence. Because it's easier to get used to it.
There was definitely culture shock, and I feel like, there might have been a way to make it easier on the students coming and the students already there, but I think that indefinitely 9 was kind of a good number.
And to add on to what Savannah said, maybe a little bit of a warning instead of just having them come into the new school year, like the year before, be like, okay, so next year we're having these students come in, be prepared, and don't treat them any different than you treat your already fellow students.
No, you can't buy happiness, but you can buy Dunkin'. That's kind of the same thing. So do yourself a favor and come to a Dunkin' near you for a sweet treat. You won't regret it. You know what they say, America runs on Dunkin'. We all know it's better than Starbucks.
What about Rosa Parks? On December 1st, 1955, an inspiring woman was arrested for standing up for what she believed in, or should I say, sitting down. Rosa Parks only refused to move from her seat on the bus, which she had every right to, and was treated like a criminal. Her actions sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott lasted a year, and it was a moment in history that we would not soon forget. It was the first large-scale U.S. demonstration against segregation. A group of black leaders known as the Montgomery Improvement Association elected Martin Luther King Jr. as its president and continued to boycott.
I'm very happy that so many people did boycott the buses, because that was definitely something that they shouldn't have done that to Rosa Parks, and the backlash she got from everything was definitely in the wrong. So I'm glad that so many people did boycott the buses, and it did bring on a spark of I don't know the word to say, inspiration to keep going and try to get your rights back from what you should have.
Just Rosa Parks in general was an inspiration. She was very brave for just standing up for herself because she was in her own seat. So just how brave she could be, knowing that there could be consequences, was truly inspirational.
Emmett Till is an example of severe violence. The 14-year-old boy was accused by a white female store owner of catcalling, touching, etc. The woman's husband and stepbrother kidnapped Till, shot him, hung him on a fence, beat him, and then drowned his body in a nearby river. The men were taken to court but didn't pay the price for their crimes. They stood in front of an all-white jury, and they were let go, not guilty. Years later, the woman admitted to lying. She as well did not serve any time. It just amazed me that how could that woman have lived with that guilt for so many years of knowing that she was the reason why that 14-year-old boy is now dead.
Honestly, we are still kids, and he's younger than us. So thinking that someone younger than us even had to deal with such consequences for something as minor as it was, it's disgusting. It honestly is. And they shouldn't have taken things like that into their own hands, because if something actually did happen in that store, why would you do that yourself? You could have said anything to the police, or if anything, you could have just let it go. I mean, I don't think that what could have happened was as big of a deal as they tried to make it, and it definitely wasn't. It shouldn't have amounted to murder.
Like you said, with doing anything with the police and such, this was a 14-year-old boy who was blamed for something they had no proof on because his skin color they thought would be okay. And the fact that they were given not guilty is kind of just a shock.
They stood in front of a white jury and a white judge, so of course they were going to be let go.
No matter what, though, he was still a kid. Let's take it back to Martin Luther King Jr. He was a huge influence with the civil rights movement. He was an advocate for nonviolent protests, and he delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," that had a tremendous impact on the movement. Even in his death in 1968, the country mourned a lost idol, but continues to live with his legacy every day.
I love the word idol, because he definitely was, and he did spark a lot of inspiration, and he did start a movement with his speeches and his rallying, and basically just his life really caused a lot of people to want to speak up for their own rights that they deserve. Okay. In conclusion, before the civil rights movement, citizens around the country weren't treated fairly. After the movement, though, situations of racial segregation and discrimination lessened. Today, we are working hard to keep our country as unbiased as possible in the eyes of civil rights.
Our time is coming to an end.
Thank you for joining us.
We hope you were enlightened.